Since the start of the Industrial Revolution, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief that consumers could have it all. Basically, nowadays consumerism is the unofficial global religion that depends upon fossil fuels. But the inconvenient truth is, by depending upon fossil fuels, humanity sowed the seeds, which could be its own destruction. Something to keep in mind: science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. This quote by Einstein is a shorthand way of saying the truth matters, and understanding the big picture requires having a historical perspective. Furthermore, the fact is, there is no painless way to tell someone an uncomfortable truth. Then there is the proverb "time waits for no man," which is a reminder not to make a bad situation worse. Fact of the matter is, a bad situation will have a worse, perhaps even fatal outcome, for all those involved, if corrective measures are not taken in time to prevent a catastrophic failure. Another fact of the matter is, people have a difficult time differentiating fact versus fiction versus a belief. In the case of scientific issues, it can take centuries for a culture to admit it was wrong in not believing a scientific fact. Case in point, the Catholic Church not believing that the earth revolves around the sun, as opposed to the false idea that the sun revolves around the earth. So what is the big difference between fact versus fiction versus a belief? Using the Catholic Church as an example, where the group once held the false idea that the sun revolves around the earth, simply put the differences: a belief is not a fact. Or said another way, a fact is a true happening whereas fiction is an imaginative happening. Using a Venn diagram, illustrates that a belief can be a false assumption, which is based on social group peer pressure to conform, or a lack of knowledge concerning global warming or climate change. Whatever your preferred noun, the inconvenient truth is, it's us, it's real, it's bad, but there's hope. Even though the subject is often in the news, and is debated by politicians, pundits, and people on both ends of the political spectrum, the fact is, average people understand essentially nothing about climate science. Basically, to put the climate puzzle together, people have to have an open mind to a broad range of facts. Specifically mention people need an open mind because, before climate infrastructure adaptations can successfully be put and work in place, people have to bite the bullet and admit that humanity has to first address a number of human nature issues. With adoption of smartphones, the average online attention span is down from 12 seconds in the year 2000 to 6 seconds in 2019. This is less than the 9-second attention span of the average goldfish. So when dealing with a complex issue like global warming, people should be reminded not to make a rash 6-second judgment with respect to the complex hot-button issue of man-made climate change. What do believers, deniers, and those in the middle have in common? According to a public study, people are scientifically illiterate. We know people are scientifically illiterate because, in 2011, researchers roamed San Diego's public parks in search of volunteers to fill out anonymous questionnaires about global warming. The researchers wanted to know how well the average American understands the basic processes responsible for global warming, and whether there's a relationship between this basic understanding and the belief that global warming is actually occurring. When Michael Rennie and his research team reviewed the questionnaires, they found that none of the volunteers could provide the actual specific explanation, thinking the 2011 findings were a fluke. And after going to a faith and science conference in 2018, where the topic of climate change was not mentioned, actually in 2019 conducted an informal poll about the science of man-made climate change at a tech conference, and for good measure, also tried an informal poll at a local environmental public interest group meetup, and was shocked to confirm the published study results. Consequently, was inspired to create a storyboard explanation about the specific science of man-made climate change. In the beginning, mankind did not affect the global climate, and life was difficult. Over time, mankind learned how to harness natural resources to improve people's living standards. Meanwhile, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, slowly at first, also went up. Fast forward, post-World War II, consumer culture abounds, natural resources are exploited to a point beyond being sustainable, and CO2 in the atmosphere starts to affect the Earth's climate. To address climate change, it is necessary to understand the problem, but, truth is, people do not actually grasp the strategic big picture. Substantial changes are needed to address adverse global climate change effects, but because of human nature, it is an uphill battle. In the realm of psychology, the Dunning-Kruger effect describes the cognitive bias of an individual's general inaptitude to recognize their lack of competence. Simply stated, people believe they are smarter and more capable than they actually are, and seems this is especially the case for those in political leadership positions. A good example of the Dunning-Kruger effect happens in a bull market. Basically, when the overall market is going up, it is not too difficult for the vast majority to make money, so people tend to believe they have more financial ingenuity than they actually possess. Fact is, the true test of financial ingenuity only shows itself in economic downturns. Another instance of the Dunning-Kruger effect happens in the realm of religion. For example, politically conservative Catholics in the USA do not seem to be able to grasp the big picture of how the first commandment relates to the theological teachings of Thomas Aquinas. Long story short, within the realm of religion, it is important for people who value faith to keep in mind that the devil is always trying to sway how an individual views a self-destructive threat like climate change, or how one might be led astray to worship a false god, like money and material goods, having a Catholic primary school education, have concerns about the popularity of the soul-crushing nature of the prosperity gospel. This is because the biblical canon of stories includes many admonishments of worshipping money and material possessions. What people need to realize is consumerism, the worshipping of material possessions, has a high environmental cost, according to science. With respect to the Dunning-Kruger effect, the sad fact is, too many people, especially those in political leadership positions, believe themselves to have exceptional abilities which actually puts the world, as we know it, in harm's way. To beat the devil, the unvarnished truth is, people have to think like Einstein, and commit to fully understand the basic science of man-made climate change. One other thing, there is a psychological idea, the bystander effect, that partly explains widespread inaction towards overall global climate change. Basically, if no one or just few react to an issue, then the vast majority perceives the situation as being uncritical. Bottom line, psychological perspectives vary, so it is important to keep in mind that the crowd is all too often complacent, assuming others are taking care of the messy devilish details that puts everyone in harm's way. The first scientific idea needed to understand the big picture of man-made climate changes, because of the enormous mass of the sun. It dominates the gravitational field of the solar system. Basically everything in our solar system, including the Earth, revolves around it. The next key scientific idea is, the sun generates energy by nuclear fusion, turning hydrogen nuclei into helium. In its core, the sun fuses 620 million metric tons of hydrogen, and makes 616 million metric tons of helium each second. Note, the simple, big picture diagram of the Earth, revolving around the sun, is not to scale. The key takeaway of this simple diagram is, during the summer season, days are longer and it is warmer, because the Earth absorbs more solar energy. Likewise, during the winter season, days are shorter and the weather is cooler, because the Earth absorbs less solar energy. Given impatient human nature, people find it difficult to relate to changes that happen over an eon. Actually, over a very long period of time, tens to 100,000 years, the orbit the Earth takes around the sun dramatically changes. The reason the orbit of the Earth changes over the eons is due to the subtle but very real gravitational influence of other planets, specifically Jupiter and Saturn, in the solar system. The puzzle of what happens to the orbit of the Earth around the sun over eons of time in science is called the Milankovitch cycle. The bottom line effect of the Milankovitch cycle on global climate is, when the Earth absorbs less solar energy for eons, an ice age happens. Likewise, an ice age ends when, for eons, the Earth absorbs more solar energy. Note, in the diagram there is a squiggly line. The squiggly line indicates incoming sunlight at a high northern latitude in mid-July, from 800,000 years ago to the present day. Keep in mind, when sunlight is weak at a high northern latitude in mid-July, the snow from the preceding winter season does not melt. If snow from the preceding winter season does not melt, thin layers of non-melting snow will, over time, form a glacier. Now notice the end of the squiggly line is heading downward, which indicates the Earth should ever so slowly be cooling down, because overall incoming sunlight is ever so slowly decreasing. Another scientific concept that needs to be understood is, greenhouse gases trap infrared heat radiation in the atmosphere. In other words, an atmosphere plays an important role in determining and moderating temperature ranges. For example, from a physics standpoint, the Earth and Moon are approximately the same distance away from the Sun. Yet science knows that the average temperature on the Moon at the equator and mid-latitudes varies from -183 degrees Celsius at night to about 106 degrees Celsius during the day. Bottom line, dramatically varying temperatures on the Moon versus the less varying temperatures on the Earth can be scientifically accounted for by factoring in the idea that a small amount of a greenhouse gas in an atmosphere traps infrared heat radiation. One of the most compelling pieces of scientific evidence of man-made climate changes, the Keeling curve, which is a daily record of global atmospheric CO2 concentrations and is maintained by Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego, learned decades ago, as a student at UC San Diego, that greenhouse gas molecules in an atmosphere are important because they play a key role in understanding the dramatic temperature differences of the Moon versus the Earth. It should not take a rocket science degree to understand that a combustion chemical reaction is something that takes a substance, like a piece of wood, that combined with an oxygen gas, ends up releasing energy in the form of light and heat. Formalizing the idea of a campfire, science has discovered combustion reactions must involve O2 as one reactant. The products of the combustion of hydrocarbons are CO2 and water. Bottom line, the Keeling curve shows since the start of the Industrial Revolution, vast quantities of CO2 have been released into the atmosphere. To grasp why the Keeling curve has rocketed upward since the start of the Industrial Revolution, realize that science has determined, from 1850 to the year 2019, 2,400 gigatons of CO2 were emitted by human activity. Incidentally, since the quantities of CO2 created by modern global civilization are so huge, scientists measure things in terms of a gigaton. Basically, a gigaton, in science, is defined to be the weight of a block of water that takes up the volume of a cubic kilometer. Over the years, I have come to believe that humans have a very difficult time dealing with issues in the future. This is because people tend to be very focused on the short term, and do not have the necessary formal training in physics and chemistry to grasp the subtle, big picture changes associated with man-made climate change. As a trained pilot, one is taught that the jet stream strongly influences weather patterns. As a pilot, one should be intimately knowledgeable about adverse weather that can severely impact a flight. But because pilots tend to be very focused on the short-term success of their flights, a trained pilot will not notice, or be on the lookout for, the subtle changes in the jet stream. As a knucklehead with a better-than-average understanding of rocket science, I conclude that humanity has indeed been able to change the climate on a global scale. The first scientific fact one needs to consider is the Keeling curve, which shows dramatic increases in the amount of CO2 measured in the Earth's atmosphere. Because CO2 in the atmosphere traps infrared heat radiation, as a physics student interested in the issue of climate change, I was taught to be on the lookout for dramatically noticeable warming effects in the polar regions. As a trained pilot, who understands the basic science of the jet stream, what I find is convincing evidence of man-made climate changes. News reports of rain falling on top of a mountain and flowers blooming in the polar regions. Basically rain falling on top of the highest mountain in the Arctic polar region, and flowers blooming in the Antarctica polar region, is akin to finding a snowball in hell. This is because, since the orbit of the Earth is ever so gradually moving away from the Sun, one would expect the Earth should ever so slightly be cooling down. Looking at the known science, fact is, because of climate change, humanity has the potential to create global flooding on a biblical scale. To grasp another adverse knock-on effect of man-made climate change, another key scientific idea to keep in mind is photosynthesis. Basically, without photosynthesis, humanity could not exist because plants and some other organisms use sunlight, water, and CO2 to create crops that people can eat, and oxygen that people can inhale. With elevated CO2 levels, the devil in the details issue is, although plants might grow bigger, appears the adverse knock-on effect is crops will be less nutritious and perhaps individual plants will create less overall oxygen. Bottom line, only when humanity grasps the potential of a multitude of adverse knock-on effects will people, and especially political leadership, take the issue of man-made climate change as something that needs to be addressed head-on. One last thing, because humanity is in a prisoner's dilemma, people need to realize that the best course of action is for global civilization to cooperate and address the issue of man-made climate change head-on. In other words, we know from game theory, when players act selfishly, this ultimately ends in the worst overall result, rather than the best possible outcome, which happens when players set aside differences and work together.